Well, I think we've got a pretty good crowd here now coming in. And so we will start moving towards getting started. We'll let a few more folks kind of sneak in and go from there. But we want to thank you once again for joining us for our Tough Question series we've been doing on Sunday mornings. And then this speaker series we've been following up on Monday nights. And as you saw in the chat, Pastor Emily Wright is saying go Bucks for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So yes, we will acknowledge that and say go Bucks with you for your hometown there. And but we're just excited about what's going on in the series. And tonight you're in for a treat. We have Dr. Andrew Root here with us. He spoke to some of our leaders in the family ministry last night with our elders and committees and some other folks about different thoughts in youth ministry. And it was a terrific night. And I know you're going to be blessed tonight. So just a quick few things before I give them a formal introduction and pass it over. We will do the presentation tonight, and I know some life groups we'll check out after the presentation, so we'll pause to let you guys sneak out, and then we'll continue with some Q&A and see kind of where we are at that point. But I'll go ahead and formally introduce Dr. Root. He has his PhD from Princeton Theological, and he is the Carrie Olson Balson Professor of Family Ministry at Luther Seminary. And he just finished writing it, just published this month, actually, January of this year, the last part in his Ministry in a Secular Age series. And I find Dr. Root's writing and just he as a person to just be an incredible practical theologian, a great thinker, taking historical, philosophical, and theological ideas and truths and just really providing them and giving great observations and insights into our current cultural moment. And so tonight, I know as we answer this question, what is the future of the church? Is there a future for the church? I think you guys are going to really enjoy getting a chance to hear from him. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Andrew Root.
Thank you, everyone. I am going to do that awkward moment where I share my screen and let you see some slides, and then we will jump into this. So just give me 1 second here. All right, and hopefully you can now see those slides. It should just be a black slide to start, but thank you all for having me. It's wonderful to be here. And so I am going to try to explore this question, does the church have a future? But I want to get at it by asking a big why question, which with others in your church last night, we looked at a why question, which was why does everything seem more important than church? But tonight with you, I want to try to answer this why question, which relates to your big question series of why is everyone leaving the church? Why does it feel like everyone is leaving the church? And last night I took way too much time and made poor Kyle nervous because I took about 10 minutes longer than I was supposed to. So tonight I'm just going to answer this right off the bat. So you've got it. And then Kyle can cut me off whenever he needs to cut me off. But the answer to why people are leaving the church is because of the secular. So that's it, Kyle. I've gone really short tonight. Thank you all. It's been great to be with you. No, I'm kidding.
Thank you.
Yeah, there you go. No, but I do think it is the secular. But here's the problem. When we say that the secular is the reason people are leaving the church is, well, the secular is a very complicated word. And we could say it's a very multivalent word to try to get a handle on what actually is the secular. There's just a lot of different dimensions to it. So what I want to do with about my 25 minutes of time is try to unfold this word and keep before us this question, why are people leaving the church? The answer is the secular, but what do we actually mean by the secular? So I want you to think with me historically, but I want you to think more than historically. I'm going to give you some kind of historical rundown here, but I also want you to think about how these larger historical changes get embedded in our imagination, and it tends to be a way that we imagine ourselves in the world. So let's step back as we try to unfold this word secular and go back to a world that's really even hard for us to imagine, but we could call this a secular zero world. This is a world where there is no secular. It's hard for us modern people to even think about this, but if you were to get into a time machine, if your church has a time machine, that would be pretty cool. And you probably wouldn't have people leaving your church if you had a time machine. But if you could get into a time machine, and if we could go back 500-600 years and find ourselves on the continent of Europe, you would be in societies where there was no secular. surely there was a difference between what was sacred and what was profane. For instance, everyone knew the priest's chalice that they gave the Eucharist in was a sacred thing, and the shovel of a farmer was a profane thing or something not used for holy reasons. But for the most part, there was no secular sense. These things all fit together perfectly. In a secular zero world, no one really leaves the church. You can't leave the church. The church is everywhere. And as a matter of fact, there are really very few to no atheists in a secular zero world if you were to go back 500 or 600 years. I don't know if you've been to Venice before, Venice, Italy, but if you walk the canals of Venice, you'll stumble upon this statue, which is one of my favorites. And you'll see it, and it will be there in a beautiful setting, of course, as Venice is. But then you'll see a plaque underneath it, and you'll have to stop some Italian person and ask them to translate it for you. Um, and if you ask them what the plaque will say, it will say Paolo Sarpi with the date of his birth and the date of his death, but then it will have a quote underneath of it in Italian. So you find a handsome Italian man to translate it for you, which is how you should spend your vacation. And you ask him, and what it will say is the quote will say Paolo Sarpi, and this is the 16th century, is when he died. It'll say Paolo Sarpi, the only unbeliever of his generation. That's a fairly amazing thing. I mean, we're talking 16th century in Europe, and he gets a statue because he's the only unbeliever of his generation. Now, I'd like to think if there was a statue for every unbeliever in Austin, Texas, well, it'd be pretty hard to drive around those streets. There'd be a lot of statues places. But in a secular zero world, and coming up to the end of the secular zero world for Paulo Sarpi, it almost wasn't possible not to believe. And to leave the church was nearly impossible. The church was everywhere. Again, it's so hard for us to get our minds around what that would actually be like. The only thought experiment I have for it is I'm a kind of a TV-aholic, so I always think of TV shows. But the only one we have is this little, very haunting, very famous show called The Handmaid's Tale. I don't know if anyone has seen The Handmaid's Tale. If you don't want to sleep for a week, you should watch The Handmaid's Tale because it is a frightening, frightening story. And it's actually a series, I think they're in season 3 now, that's based off these books by the Canadian author Margaret Atwood. And she's imagining, it's a kind of dystopian movie or series in the book series. And what she's imagining is that America has fallen, and it's fallen to a very right-wing radical religious group, and America no longer exists, or actually it does exist. It exists as a little enclave in Toronto, and what's taken over is this place called Gilead. And it is funny to me that she makes America a little enclave that exists in Toronto, which as a Canadian author just feels like the ultimate Canadian fantasy. But I don't know if you have any Canadians here, but there's always fantasies about America falling in Canadian dreams, but at least in hockey. But this whole show is this idea of what would happen if a kind of secular zero world returned after modernity, and it's really frightening. It's quite frightening, but you can see it. The way people dress in this show all is based in kind of religious commitments and who's a leader and who's not. In the way they talk, they'll say when they go to the supermarket, "May the Lord open," or "under his eye," which really is the liturgy spilling out into regular society, that you continue to reenact the liturgy. And so belief is just everywhere in this. You can't escape it. There's no way to leave the church when you're in a secular zero world. As a matter of fact, for Margaret Atwood, it is absolutely frightening to think that we could return to a secular zero world. And she thinks it's frightening because you need 3 things that we just don't have anymore. And back in a secular zero world, you needed a sense that the world was deeply enchanted. Another way to think about this is that there were demons and devils everywhere, and they were affecting everything. That things themselves, which is really hard for us modern people to get our minds around, but that the things you could touch and feel, particularly holy things, could be charged with the divine force, that you could have a relic that could mean something. And then that the self was porous. In other words, things could get into it. Now, I could take up a lot of my time telling you stories that I find very fascinating about these 3 things, but I'm going to resist the temptation, but just tell you one. And for instance, if you were to go back to the 4th century, one of the great saints of Christianity, St. Augustine, when he was about 8 or 9 years old, the story goes that he got the flu or he got sick. And his mother, who meant so much to him, Monica, she was very worried about him. She was frightened. So the story goes that she stripped him naked and got him wet, got him damp enough that she could then take him as an 8 or 9-year-old and roll him in salt. And the idea was that he was vulnerable, that he was now open to the devil and demons getting inside of him. So if she wrapped him in salt, if she put him in salt, then that would resist and that would keep the devil away. Now, my very terrible joke is it's clear then that the devil and demon are more into sweet treats than savory treats, but then you roll your eyes severely at that terrible joke. But that's actually part of my pedagogical point because I don't know, I can't see all your faces. I can only see about 6 of you right now, but I didn't see any of you get really frightened when I said that. Or if we were in a room together, I doubt if I would have said that terrible joke, you would judge my joke. You wouldn't think, oh my gosh, he just in our church right now insulted the devil, and that puts us all at risk. Please, sir, don't do that. We tend not to think of that imagination. While we still have some sense of enchantment, we don't have this deep enchanted realm before us that we're wrestling with. And we tend not to think like, oh, our young people may leave the church. If we could just find a way to get Peter's teeth in our church and have a reliquary to Peter, then they would all stay. And we tend not to think of those things. But in a secular zero world, for good and for ill, no one can leave the church. You are in it. So they're not leaving. People are not leaving the church because we still exist in a secular zero world. But that moves us forward in our story, and we enter into what we might call a secular one world. Now, secular one means the arrival of the secular, that the secular actually shows up in our societies, it shows up in our imagination. But what secular one means is that there now is a divide and almost a conflict, or at least a kind of chafing, rubbing friction between what we might call the public and the private. So think about it this way, and this still kind of holds on with us, that we tend to think at a dinner party, there are 4 things that polite people don't talk about. Usually we say, polite people at a dinner party, we tell our grandchildren or our children, you shouldn't talk about money at a dinner party. That's really not polite. You shouldn't talk about politics, even though that's nearly impossible in our day and age. But you shouldn't talk about politics at a dinner party. That's really not polite talk either. You surely should never, ever at a dinner party talk about sex. That is really not something that you do. And the 4th thing that you never talk about, of course, at a dinner party, you're not supposed to in polite company, is talk about religion. And the idea is money, politics, sex, religion, these are private things. And good mannered people don't talk about private things in a public realm. So what happens when the secular starts to dawn is we start to have this kind of imagination where we see a divide between the public and the private. And belief, faith, your decision to go to church or not go to church becomes a private matter. It really becomes up to you. It becomes your own private thing. Well, this means that we have a transition away from those kind of chanted things of enchantment and a porous self, and we move into what becomes really important is wills. The will becomes important. In other words, will you, in your own consciousness, will, for instance, to participate in church? Will you will to believe? And it becomes a kind of mindset you have. So belief becomes something that you almost individually do and individually commit to. Now, when I shared my slides, I made the very rookie mistake of not clicking the share audio button. So I have a video clip that I would show you, but you wouldn't be able to hear it. So we'll skip it, and I won't act it out because that would be terrible for me to play all the parts of it. But it's a clip actually from, I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's a clip from the news. And it was right after Notre Dame set ablaze, which was what, about 18 or 20 months ago, I remember, in France when Notre Dame was on fire. And it was on the PBS NewsHour, and they were interviewing the dean of the American Chapel in Paris, American woman who lives in Paris. And she was talking about how tragic it was that Notre Dame had started on fire and how sad that was, and about the relics that were in it. And she says these really interesting and powerful words where she says, now, was it really Jesus' crown of thorns that's in Notre Dame? Well, that doesn't really matter. What matters is not if it really was. What matters is that it was important to people and people prayed to it. So you see this transition where the thing itself doesn't have to hold a divine charge. What matters is that people consent, that it means something to them, that it means something to their own individual wills. So this becomes a very different way of constituting belief. That belief is something you privately commit to. And being part of a church now is something that you privately decide to be part of, and you're part of it as long as it works. Now, when we think of this historically, when this starts to happen, and particularly comes into kind of full bloom in the 18th and then throughout the 19th century and even into the early 20th century. But this really becomes the time, as especially as that time unfolds, the time of the denomination. And denominations, all of them, particularly mainline denominations, but all of our denominations, I mean, when we ask the question, will the church have a future? How will the church continue? I mean, we can't ask that question outside of asking the question, will our denomination? Maybe our congregation will last longer than the denomination, or maybe it will be the other way around, that the denomination will last longer than our congregations. But it becomes in this time that, in this kind of sense of the wills, that denominations can only really exist. And I'm thinking like Presbyterian and Lutheran and Methodist. They can only really exist for one generation. In other words, the next generation has to renew a commitment to them, has to decide, as I think about my own private life, I do see myself as a Presbyterian. And if they decide, if a whole generation of people decides that they won't do that, then the PCUSA will not exist. That, in other words, every generation has to renew and consent that, at least in the private sense of their own belief or their own faith life, that they'll commit to going. So much like the PCUSA, the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, has what they call a youth gathering every 3 years, kind of like the triennium. And I was at one a few years ago. It was in San Antonio, fairly close to where you all are. And it's a big deal in this denomination to have it, much like in the PCUSA. And they spend a huge amount of just the denomination's budget on this one event. That's every 3 years. And it was like day 2, and I was walking, and it was great. I mean, it's a huge, I think at this time it was in the Dome down in San Antonio, and it was packed. There were, 25, 30,000 people there, and the young people were just really enjoying it. And so in between sessions, I was walking behind 2 high school girls, and they were good friends. And one of them did that kind of move. I could show you if I was standing in front of you, where you kind of walk next to your friend, but then you kick them. You kind of lift your knee and kick them so they don't know really where it's coming from. And it was all done in fun. It was just kind of teasing fun. And the girl who got kicked knew immediately that her friend had done it. And so she looked at her, and they must have been from California, because they had this kind of like, oh my gosh. And she says, oh my gosh, I can't believe you just kicked me. And they're just being playful with each other. But then the girl that got kicked said this that I found so fascinating. She looked at her and she said, oh my gosh, I can't believe you just kicked me. She said, that is such an un-Lutheran thing to do. And I thought to myself, I was kind of taken back as an eavesdropper on this conversation. And I thought, on a Lutheran thing to do, like on Lutheran thing. And I thought to myself, like, if the other girl would have turned to her and said, hey, I know we're hearing all this stuff about the Lutheran church and stuff, but I just want you to know you're not saved by grace, you're actually saved by works. That would have been a very un-Lutheran thing to do. Now, at least your pastors here find that joke funny. Maybe none of the rest of you do. But on Lutheran, I was just shocked by that. She didn't say like that's an unethical thing to do, or that's a mean thing to do, or that's an unchristian thing to do. She said that's an un-Lutheran thing to do. And what was insightful for me in that comment is that she got exactly why the denomination was pouring millions of dollars into this event. That this event, and I say the same thing about the triennium, that it really exists to have the next generation re-up, or be willing to at least imagine what it will be like as an adult to be part of the PCUSA. Because of the matter of fact, it's just the fact that if the young people do not see it as part of their lives, a denomination can only exist for another generation. So this really is the time where we start to think about belief as somehow getting inside people's wills and getting them to will to be part of this. Or people can decide, this just isn't for me. I'm out. So now it becomes possible for people to leave. Like back in a secular zero world, you can't leave, but now it becomes possible. But the truth of the matter is, historically, is even as this dawns, most people don't, because they still understand their own identities as part of a religious commitment. They still live their lives in a more collective. And so for the most part, it doesn't happen until we start to enter into closer into the mid to even the late 20th century. And we enter into what we might call secular II. So if secular one is this divide between public and private, what happens in secular two is this public private divide almost becomes more competitive. And this is just about everyone I talk to tends to think answering that why question, or for you all answering the how question, really is a secular two question. And what I mean by that is that secular two has this sense that there is a kind of death struggle competition between religious spaces and a-religious spaces. Like last night with some of the folks in your church, we talked a lot about why will parents go to all sorts of, take their kids to all sorts of sporting events and all sorts of other extracurricular activities instead of going to church? Why is youth group and confirmation way down the list compared to everything else? Which is this kind of secular two sense that there is limited resources, that there is limited time, and there is a fight between secular spaces or a-religious spaces and religious spaces. So belief becomes, how can we get people committed to religious spaces over a-religious spaces? And so secular two, as its definition, is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. And this is kind of what we feel like our issue is. Will the church survive? Does the church have a future? We often think and feel it existentially that it might not, because fewer and fewer people are going to church. But what this does, that I want us to be aware of and think about, is when we see the issue as a secular two issue, is that our problem when it comes to belief, and belief for the next generation or belief for the future of the church, is really a battle between religious and a-religious spaces, is that we adopt this kind of competitive framework. And then we tend to see everything as a battle over resources. Will the church will only survive if it has more resources, and it needs more resources, and it's losing resources. And that very resource framework then gets kind of glued onto what the church is even for. So I had a student who told me a few weeks ago that he says he would never recommend this, and I would never recommend this to you, particularly if you're one of the pastors, is to do a Google search of your church, like a Google review search of your church. So he was happened to be online and searched his church online and realized that there were these Google ratings for his church that, and to his great comfort, his church had 5 out of 5 stars. So he felt good. There were only 3 reviews, but there were 5 out of 5 stars. So he felt okay about that. But then he started to read the reviews and he said, it felt really weird, because as he read the reviews, they took the shape of like an Airbnb review. So they started talking about, like, all the reviews were like, this is a great church. It's got this, it's got that, it's comfortable, everything is clean. And like it started to kind of take this shape. And he's like, gosh, I don't know if I feel good about that or bad about that. I mean, I'm glad these people gave us 5 stars, but it did kind of take the shape of the amenities the church provides. And in the secular two sense, when we start to feel the loss of the vitality of belief, then we start to run around and think, okay, what kind of amenities do we need to keep people? How do we keep people? What kind of resources will get them to stick and to stay? How can we get belief to be a sticky thing that actually gets people to stay? And we become very much resource obsessed and think that the only churches can survive, the only denominations that can survive are those with the most resources. So we've got to get cutthroat on getting as many resources as we can. Now, here's the thing. I understand that. I understand that deeply, and I understand that existentially. I mean, I teach at a mainline seminary, and I'm very aware if the denomination loses another 10% of people, it'll be very hard to fund seminary education. So I get that. And if you are in charge of the church budget, that's a big, big deal. But when it comes to belief, or when it comes to why are people leaving the church, I don't think people are leaving the church because they just don't have enough resources, because your church or any church is Google rating isn't high enough, that there's not enough amenities to bring them. I don't think that's it. Though almost all the time in our conversations, we get stuck in that. Rather, I think the reason that people are leaving the church, or the challenge that we confront, is what we might call secular three. That secular three is actually our issue. So how would I define secular three? I would define secular three is the state where all belief becomes contested. Or we could say it this way, where all belief becomes fragilized, that all belief is fragile. And there's both a negative and a positive element to this. And I don't want you even to think of that kind of pejoratively, like a good, bad, but think of it like a battery that has a plus and a minus to it. And the negative is that in a secular three world, there is this kind of loss of transcendence, this idea that there's something bigger than you that calls out to you, that there's a speaking God who directs us and leads us, whom answers prayers and speaks to us. That becomes more and more unbelievable for people. Almost as a reflex, it becomes more and more unbelievable. But there's a positive element. And the positive element up against this is that people really are deeply searching for meaning. They really want their lives to mean something. Many people are on a search to find something significant to actually live for. So the person that I'm kind of leaning on as I talk about this is a Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor. And one of the things Taylor says is this secular three reality of fragilization is what he calls a two-way fragilization. And what he means by that is when you're inside a secular three and you're a believing person, you can't help not doubting sometimes. That you just doubt sometimes. It's impossible to escape it. That if you're a believing person, you'd really truly passionately believe. But sometimes you're struck with doubt. Sometimes you think to yourself, is this really true? Or was just this the family I grew up in? I mean, if I would have grown up in a different family, would I still believe this? Or you think, no, this is true. This is true. But then you get struck again by a fragilization, by a doubt, and you wonder, is this true? Or is this just false pattern recognition? I mean, is this just an evolutionary trick? And he says, if you're a believing person, you can't help but be fragilized at times. But what's so fascinating about this 70-year-old Canadian philosopher is he says it works the other way too. Like, let's say, for instance, that your belief system is that you don't believe. Let's say that you live in Austin and you're a young adult. You're a UT grad and you're in a band and you're also working on an app or whatever other stereotype we could have. But you've pretty much figured this out and you know what religion is and you know what faith is. It is just, this is, it's nothing. It's just a historical ploy to keep power from people. And you know what happens after you die. After you die, it's like turning a TV set off or unplugging it. It just goes dark. That's all that it is. That that's your belief system, is that you don't believe. Well, Taylor says what will happen to you is that sometimes you will find your unbelief fragilized, that you are sure you don't believe. And then you'll be invited to your nephew's Christmas concert and you'll sit there and you'll listen to Bach and something will strike you and you'll wonder to yourself, wait a minute, is there something more here? Or maybe really profoundly, which happens in congregational life, you'll have your first child and you'll think there's no meaning. The universe is just a random place. It's just random that there's human life at all. And then you'll hold that baby for the first time and you'll find something bigger and greater reach out for you, that you find even your unbelief fragilized. So all of us in a secular three world find ourselves and our beliefs in a kind of fragile place. But the real issue for us and the real challenge that we have to confront, or at least admit that this is the environment we live in, is what Taylor would then call living inside an imminent frame. So what he means by that is we all come, because of our culture, we all come with a kind of default setting. Like when you take your phone out of the box and fire it up for the first time, it's set on a default mechanism. And he wants to say our default mechanism, whether you're a believer or not a believer, whether you're fragilized in your belief or fragilized in your unbelief, our default system that we all share is an imminent one, as opposed to a transcendent one, like people in a secular zero world. Ours is an imminent one, that we tend to see the world first and foremost as natural and material. So here's a quote from Taylor and gives you a picture of him. He says, the imminent frame is a constructed social space that frames our lives entirely within a natural rather than a supernatural order. It's a circumscribed space of the modern social imaginary that precludes transcendence. All right, that's philosopher talk. And some of you are like, the 6 cups of coffee I've had have now worn off, and that makes me really tired. So let me try to help this make sense to you and land the plane a little bit by showing you some lyrics from a pop star. Now, I can't see all of you, but those of you I see, you look like you're big, like British pop fans. All right, maybe not, but go with me on this. So let me show you some lyrics from a British pop star named Lily Allen. And this, I'm not very cutting edge because this song's about 10 years old, but you might not know that. So just think that I am very hip and very cool. So here's a lyric she has. She says, life's about film stars and less about mothers, but it doesn't matter because I'm packing plastic and that's what makes my life so effing fantastic. All right, this is very in your face. She's very irreverent. And to be completely honest, I have no idea what these lyrics mean. And it's a very dangerous thing to ever exegete, to try to interpret deeply a pop star's lyrics. So I don't know what they mean. I don't know what packing plastic means. I think it means she has a credit card with a major credit limit on it. Or maybe it's that she's had a certain enhancement that she's had that makes her feel more confident. I don't know what that means. But the second lyric is what I want you to look at here in the second slide, where she says, now I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault. It's how I'm programmed to function. Now, here it is. This is the imminent frame. She says, now I'm not a saint, but I'm not a sinner. But everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. That's a haunting assertion. Now, think of that. For most of human history, for sure, at least within the Western world, people cared deeply, very deeply, if they were a saint or a sinner, if they were bound for heaven or they were bound for hell. That was on the front of their minds, wondering about that. And actually, it led to huge fits of anxiety for people across Europe. Especially in the 15th century, it was leading to huge amounts of anxiety. And Martin Luther comes around with this incredibly constructive theological move. He calls it his simul, his simultaneousness. And he says it's actually not that you are saint or sinner, one or the other. It's actually that you're both simultaneously, that you are sinner and by Christ you are justified. So you are simultaneously saint and sinner. And that was an incredible balm for Protestantism for a few hundred years, all the way up until the 21st century in this British pop star. Okay, I'm not going to give her that much credit, but she illustrates this where she basically says, this kind of category of a transcendent reality, if I'm saint or sinner, what's my eternal destination? I don't care. I really, I don't care. I don't really care at all. But this doesn't mean she's outgrown fear or anxiety or even feeling guilt. She hasn't outgrown that at all. She feels all of those things. They've just shifted from a kind of transcendent reality to a very imminent one. What wakes her up in the middle of the night is not, am I bound for heaven or hell? What wakes her up is thinking, swimsuit season's coming. What are people going to think? Am I ready for that? That's what he means by a kind of imminent frame, that our biggest fears tend to be more natural and material, at least at reflex, than beyond that. And I think this becomes the challenge. The challenge is that inside of this imminent frame, a lot of people find it very cold, find it flattening of meaning, and yet are looking for meaning, but also are struggling with, can they believe in a living, speaking God who acts and moves? Can the biblical text still have something to say to them? And I think so often we get caught in that secular two frame where we're thinking, how can we just get more people to come? How can we have more amenities? How can we get more programming so people come? How can we make our church more sticky and have more hooks that keep people coming? We're really, I think, people all across the world, but particularly in places like Austin, are really yearning for, how do I think of God in the midst of this? How do I deal with my own fragilization? Is there a community of people who, in fear and in doubt, are seeking for a living God, are leaning towards a living God? The future of the church will never be, I mean, I think we think in a secular two frame that the future of the church is dependent on us finding some way to get 10 or 15% growth, or at least upend decline. And yeah, those are issues, real institutional issues we have to deal with. But the church's future is embedded in something much deeper, in the confession that there's a God made known to us in Jesus Christ who continues to act and to move. And the reality for a lot of us is that becomes unbelievable. Not that it can't be believed in, but it becomes hard. And we doubt ourselves as much as we long for it. And we need the narratives of one another. We need the confessions of one another. We need the prayers of one another to lean into this. And we need to embrace doubt, not as a negative thing, but as the beckoning of the community that holds us within those articulations and within those doubts. So Taylor says this, he says, we can't help looking over our shoulder from time to time, looking sideways, living our faith in a condition of uncertainty and doubt. And what he means by that is another word he calls cross-pressured, is that all of us at one time or another feel cross-pressured. Like we believe this, we know this is true, and then we hear that news story and we feel cross-pressured. Or we're one of those leading elites of South by Southwest. We know that religion has no purpose and meaning, that there's some kind of free art is the most important thing. And then we get cross-pressured and we wonder, is there something more? And poor Lily Allen herself gets cross-pressured because those were her verses. I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault. So I'm programmed to function. I'm not a saint. I'm not a sinner, but everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. But this is those are the choruses, and this is or excuse me, that was the verses, and this is the chorus. The chorus says, I don't know what's right or what's real anymore. I don't know how I'm meant to feel anymore. When do you think it all becomes clear? Because I'm being overtaken by the fear. That even she gets crossed up. And I think at a deep level, she's yearning too for a community that can wrestle with her deepest questions, that can be in a sense a community in process, or a community that's pilgriming, that community that's searching for this living God and being faithful to seeking for the voice of this living God, even in a world where our default mechanism is more immanence than transcendence. So with that, I was going to show you, I was going to play you a song, but because I didn't click that box and we're at our time, and last night I went too long, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Kyle and allow us to transition.
Well, thank you, Dr. Root. I know, like I said in the introduction, Dr. Root's written a 3-part trilogy series about ministry in the secular age, and he gave us a quick overview. And I'll just put a quick plug in that Peggy in the library has picked up Andrew's trilogy, and you can check it out there, or you can find it wherever books are sold. Stacy, did you want to say something to dismiss the groups before we head into Q&A?
Yeah, I'm simply going to invite the folks in the Prater Life Group to leave us at this point. I know you guys have some discussing to do. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week.
And as they head out, we can move into some Q&A here with those of you who are still with us. And we can do it a couple of ways. I'm happy to let you kind of let us know and ask a question. I don't know if I can see everybody on the screen. Or you can also throw a question in chat. And while you guys kind of think or do that, I'll just say this. My first thought, kind of there at the end of the presentation is, man, it's a lot easier to answer the questions and to get active and busy and to work towards a secular 2 frame than it feels like it is in a secular 3 frame. And I don't know if you have a good thought on that, but it seems easier to go towards resources and amenities and things that feel practical as opposed to what feels a little more existential in the secular 3 stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think initially that's really true, is that it feels more concrete. It feels more direct, that if we could just, get the right programming, use the right marketing, then we could get people to come and to show up. It is interesting, however, is when we get caught in this kind of resource obsession, one of the things it does is it continues to speed up our lives. I mean, once you start to add more and more resources, you have to continue to support more and more resources. And that does lead to an acceleration. And I think one of the struggles of being these late modern people that we are, and this would be really interesting as we come out of a pandemic, God willing, come out of a pandemic and the vaccine is here, that we've been forced to slow our lives down a great deal. And a lot of the resources that we did use at our churches, like I know so many churches that have, $1 million organs that haven't been touched in, coming on 9 months now, and, buildings that haven't been touched, and, staff that tragically had to be let go because they couldn't gather. But there's going to be, I think, this beckoning as we come out of this pandemic to rush all the more and try to, all the losses in secular too, try to win those back. But there is the danger that the more we do that it alienates us. I think it alienates us from ourselves. It alienates us from our deeper questions. It rushes us so much that I think the real struggle here is, how do we take on certain practices where we can hear God speak again, where we can be led by God deeper into each other's lives, and hear God speak again. And one of the, I think, struggles of the late modern world is that things move so fast and at such a frantic pace that it's really hard to pay attention to something bigger and more transcendent that goes at a different pace. And so that will be interesting coming out of this. But yeah, it feels more concrete, and until it doesn't, until it turns on you and becomes its own, it becomes like tragically the family dog that you feed and take care of, and then bites you at some time and you feel so betrayed. But I think that's really true.
What do you have any examples or thoughts on how the church can help people who are kind of in that space where we are feeling like our beliefs are fragilized?
Yeah, I mean, it's a struggle because I'm very aware, having a 16-year-old, that it's really easy when whoever's fragilized is, not your own kid, but when it's like your own kid, you want to deal with this fragilization. You have this deep temptation to fix this fragilization. The kind of hip liminality is great for someone else's kid or someone else's grandkid, but for your own, we all feel that tension. But I think the issue with the kind of fragilization is, one of the confessions is, I think, for us, that there's no way outside of it. And I think one of the kind of negative views of the church has often been a certain denial that we too are fragilized, that we too live in doubt as much as assurance, or our assurance even comes through doubt. So that there's something in like that Mark 9 text of, which is one of my favorite stories of the Gospels, where Jesus comes to the Father and the Father says, "I believe, help my unbelief." But what we often miss before that phrase, which is so powerful, is that Jesus walks back into the scene that's chaos. I mean, it's actually quite a tragic tale, because this father has, we're not sure how long, but it seems like he's walked for a distance, or he's at least got over some obstacles to come and bring his son, who is having a very bad time, and is, the father must feel like he's losing his son. And he shows up. Jesus isn't there. Jesus is on vacation, essentially. He's taken his three best buddies, Peter, James, and John, and gone up on a mountain where the transfiguration happens. But then what's his father to do but to say to the disciples, "Will you heal my boy? I mean, you've seen how Jesus does this, do it." And it doesn't work. I mean, it's one of the most tragic tales of the New Testament that doesn't work. And all of us know there's nothing more painful than having worked yourself up to hope again. Like, this treatment is going to work. This time he's going to get it. This counselor will help him through. This interview, this time I'm going to get the job. Like, working yourself up to risk and to hope again, and then to find that crash against the rocks of impossibility, is deeply, deeply painful. And that's where this father is when Jesus walks back in Mark 9. And Jesus asked the most profound question that leads to that beautiful statement of New Testament faith: "I believe, help my unbelief." And what he does is he asks, "How long? How long has your boy been like this?" Which is such a profound statement, but we miss it as late modern people, because we imagine that is a diagnostic question. Like when you go to the doctor and the doctor says, "How long has the rash been there?" Or you take your computer into IT and they ask, "Well, how long has it been since the operating system is actually rebooted?" We think it's a diagnostic question, but there's really no correlation of Jesus asking diagnostic questions in his healing miracles. It's not a diagnostic question. It's actually the invitation for this father to narrate the depth of his experience, to confess his broken heart. How long? Long enough for it to be killing me, long enough for me to think that I've lost the one thing I love more than anything in the world, this boy, long enough for my heart to be broken in a million pieces. And out of that narration of experience, the father finds just enough, I mean, just a sliver enough of hope to say, but teacher, if you are able, almost like wincing, not wanting to get hurt again with any expectations. That if you are able, and Jesus stopped him and said, essentially Jesus stopped him and said, "If I am able." I was just up on a mountain with Peter, James, and John, and we saw Elijah and Moses. Like, I was just talking with dead people, man. If I am able, he says, "If I am able, all things are possible for those who believe. And then that's when we get this incredible statement of New Testament faith, which I believe help my unbelief. So someone who's in fragilization, and to help them get to a place where they might be able to say, I believe, help my unbelief, that the only way to do that is to be near them, minister to them, and to ask them, how long? How long have you felt so alone? It's to be present with them and to live with them and to say back to yourself, to them, how long? How long has it been that you have prayed to Jesus? How long has it been since you lost your spouse and yet you feel in the deep crater of pain that God's presence, that the Holy Spirit was there seeing you through? Like the humility of articulating your own how long experiences and inviting someone else to share how long, there becomes something profound. And faith can only be, dare I say, this kind of weak act that is so profoundly powerful, so powerful that faith participates in what is dead and makes it alive. That this is the work that God does, that God takes what is dead and makes it alive. But that profession often comes through the articulation of our how long experiences. So in Secular 3, the more a community can honestly wrestle with these experiences of loss and of fragility themselves, and then be a community that supports one another in seeking for God in and through those experiences, then what we say to the world is really, how long? And we desire to be near you and hear your and legitimately hear your story of how long. If it's a Secular 2 reality, you ask the how long so you can find the opening to convince them to come to your church and get them in this group and get them signed up and then get them to be giving. But if it's a Secular 3, the how long is, how might we minister to one another? How might we participate in each other's lives? How can we together go on a pilgrimage of seeking for a God who is present and who deeply cares about our how long experiences, who actually takes those broken experiences and ministers to them so that what is dead becomes new life, and out of that death comes new life. And that's, back to your point at the beginning, Kyle, that's harder in some ways. In some ways it's easier, because you don't need to raise a bunch of money and you don't need to find a bunch of new talented pastors to do it. But it's harder because it forces you to actually have to be yourself and be people with each other who are broken and in yearning. And that's sometimes harder. So there's both possibility, and it also does cost us something, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian during the World War II era, would say, that grace is a costly grace. And what it costs us is not just energy and output, but it costs us the sense of being present with each other and seeking for God in what is lost, and being near one another in such a way.